Hey everybody, welcome back. It's Audrey from Audrey Approved. I don't read super seasonally when it comes to spring and summer, but for fall and winter I do enjoy an autumnal or a wintry read. And so everybody's been releasing fall recommendations, fall TBRs, and so I am going to do a kind of mashup of all of that into a single video. So I'm going to combine fall recommendations with recent books that I've read in the autumnal spirit, along with, I guess, autumnal TBR videos, books that I want to get to soon. I'm going to organize them by subgenre because I like organizing my books into certain buckets. But yeah, I'll jump right in and I hope you enjoy. So like many people, I think one of the first things I think of when I think of fall reading are magical schools, and a little bit of that dark academia vibe. But I'm not a big like contemporary dark academia reader, but I do like the magical version of it. So the first book that I want to recommend is Lirael by Garth Nix, which is the second book in the Old Kingdom trilogy or series. I think it might be more than 3 books now. This is the second book, but I recommend the entire series. It's a 2000s YA fantasy novel, but I read it for the very first time just a few years ago and I totally ate it up. It takes place in a world that is very unique. It's got a very unique magic system and world building. And this world needs to have a balance between the living and the dead. And so the sorcerers and the magicians in this world are responsible for maintaining that balance. And they do this through the use of these necromancer bells, like literal like bells ding dong, that they use to control the dead. And so it really is, beyond that, just a really good coming of age story. I think if you really like old school YA, then you'll really enjoy this one as well. Another book that falls into this category is A Deadly Education by Naomi Novik, which is the first book in the Scholomance trilogy. All the books in this section are a part of broader series. For a full caveat, I did not finish the Scholomance series. I actually DNF'd the 3rd book, but I loved this first book in the series, and I think you can read it as a standalone. It's a very kind of quirky magical school in that it's really trying to kill its students. And so you follow a group of students that are trying to just survive through their first year in this school. I think it says a lot about loneliness and friendships in the actual kind of plot and how the characters are interwoven. But I don't think since Hogwarts I've read a story about a school that has so much character. Like, I think the actual Scholomance itself is a character in this series, and yeah, I just found it really endearing and really funny at times. So highly recommend, even if you don't finish all of the books in this series. The last I want to recommend in this series is actually Gideon the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir, which is part of a broader series. I don't actually remember what it's called. I'll put it up. And I recently read this and I loved it. It does not actually take place in a school, caveat, but it takes place in this old, decrepit, abandoned castle, and it's got a competition that's involved in the plot, and so I feel like it kind of fits into this category. We follow Gideon, who is a very talented and sarcastic swordswoman, and she has a very contentious relationship with a necromancer named Harrow. And her and Harrow are representing their planet in a competition that involves 8 other planets, and so each of those planets have a warrior necromancer pair. And I just found that this like plot was very unique. There's a ton of humor in here, although I do think that it is very modern humor, so if you find that jarring when you read modern humor in kind of fantastical worlds, you might not like that. It's very violent and it's very gory, but I just had such a good time with it. It was just such a fun read. And nobody that reviews this ever says this, but the author has such good vocabulary. I feel like I was looking up words left and right. I have a Kindle, so I can just kind of press on the word and have it defined. And she just integrated all of these kind of new vocab words for me into the text without it feeling like she was being pretentious at all. So I learned a lot of really new words, really interesting new words from reading this. When it comes to a TBR for this category, I really just want to finish more books from this series. So I want to get to Harrow the Ninth next, second book in the series. I just got it from the library onto my Kindle, so I'm very eager to jump back in. When it comes to fall, I also think about retellings and folktales, like I think many other people. And so there's only one book that I want to talk about today, but I do want to do in general like a retellings video, a video of my favorite retellings. But one of my absolute favorite books, just hard stop books, not even for this category, is Daughter of the Forest by Juliet Marillier, which is the first book in the Sevenwaters series, which is a series of, it's actually 2 trilogies that are connected. And this is a retelling of The Six Swans, which is a fairy tale first kind of collected in the Brothers Grimm's collections, which is a dark story, so maybe look at some of the trigger warnings for it if you are sensitive to trigger warnings. But I love Juliet Marillier, and this was my entrance into her world. I've read, I don't know, 15 or 20 of her books now, most of her backlist, but this remains my absolute favorite series within her backlist, and I can't recommend it enough. It is I would call a very slow, character-driven historical fantasy set in a world that resembles kind of ancient Ireland, but there are elements of magic involved. I think if you're looking for a very immersive, very slow read, then I cannot recommend this one enough. A book that I really want to get to soon is Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. So many people that I am friends with or that I follow on Goodreads have given this 4 or 5 stars. They call it a maybe dark but humorous fairy tale, and so I think this is kind of perfect for this category. So I'm also eager, I'm gonna say that multiple times, but I'm eager to get to this one as well. When it comes to romances, there are so many options. People have videos that are just 100% fall romances, like not even any other types of genres. And so there's a lot of stuff to choose from. I have read 3 fall romances recently, which I'll say were all enjoyable, but maybe not memorable, so maybe I'll quickly touch on those. The first was The Fake Mate by Lana Ferguson, which is a very spicy, extremely spicy, at least for me, Omega-verse paranormal romance that takes place between 2 doctors that are werewolves. I thought it was fun. It was a good time, but again, maybe not super memorable. I also picked up One Dark Window by Rachel Gillig. I can never remember that author's name, which I was a little hesitant on, I think maybe because I'm not a huge fan of this cover. This is an interesting read, and people recommend it a lot when it comes to autumnal books. It's got a really weird, sorry, but I did think it's a little bit weird, magic system, which is based on almost tarot cards. And so there are all these different cards from a deck, and each card gives its owner a certain kind of power. I don't know. There's also a bit of a fake dating trope in it, which is not my favorite trope to read in romance. I don't know, this, it felt very YA and maybe a little bit forced in certain things. There's also a monster that lives inside the mind of the main character, and he only speaks in verse. That being said, I blazed through this. I read it so quickly, so obviously I must enjoy it. It must have worked for me. I didn't continue with the series, I'm not going to, but I think it's a good beach read. I don't know what the fall version of a beach read would be, but I think it's a good lighthearted read to read if you're just looking for something quick to get through. And then the most recent book that I finished just a few days ago was The Dead Romantics by Ashley Poston, something like this. And I think this is a good book for someone who likes their contemporary romances to include a lot of character development. And so our main female lead here is coming back to her hometown for the first time in a really long time for her father's funeral. So she obviously has a lot of grief. She also happens to be able to see and speak to ghosts, and she, without meaning to, falls in love with a ghost that she meets. But again, I think somebody who enjoys books like Emily Henry might enjoy this, because at least half the book, more than half the book, is spent on the main character's kind of journey coming to terms with her losses and the events that have happened in her life. And less than half the book is focused on the actual romance itself. I think it's a really good autumnal read just because it has ghosts and it has this kind of small town vibe. And so out of the 3 that I've read recently, this was definitely my favorite. I think it's a good pick for someone looking for something to pick up in the romance category. When it comes to books that I have not read recently, but I do want to recommend, we have You Again by Kate Goldberg, which I'm cheating a little bit on because the only reason this is an autumnal recommendation is because the cover is so very autumnal. But this is a great book. This was a 5-star read for me when I read it last year, although it has really low reviews on Goodreads. I'm not quite sure why. I would call this a mix of literary fiction with contemporary romance. It takes place in New York City, and the premise is that the 2 main leads first meet for the first time when they are dating the same woman, and then it follows their lives over the next, 10 or 15 years as they slowly start to randomly meet up, and then they become friends, and then they become something more. It's got a little bit of that messy millennial love in it, but I just thought this was a really good, very accurate depiction. Like I could believe these characters were real people that exist. And then the other book that I think is really good for fall that I read last year is Bride by Ali Hazelwood. I'm a really big Ali Hazelwood stan. I love her STEM books, and initially I was a little bit disappointed that this also wasn't a STEM book, although it kind of is. But it just hit all the same plot points that I really like about her other books. This is again a paranormal romance between a vampire and a werewolf who have a political alliance through a marriage of convenience, but then that marriage of convenience becomes something a little bit more. Yeah, a great read if you're looking for a fall romance book. Classics are another thing that pops up when people talk about fall recommendations. And so the ultimate kind of classic, right, would be Frankenstein by Mary Shelly, which I am currently 20% into. And I am considering DNFing. So you can convince me otherwise if you think it's worth going onwards. I think this might be an example of a book that is more interesting to me in its pop history and its in how it's changed over time, how people have viewed the story of Frankenstein over time, than the story actually is to myself. It almost feels unemotional read. It's very kind of rote, I feel like, in how it's recounting certain events. But the story of Frankenstein is very different from the popular culture image of Frankenstein. And so this may be interesting to read for its historical context, but I can't say I'm enjoying it right now. The book that I do want to recommend when it comes to classics is Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo, which is a Mexican classic. It's also, in my preparation for this video, I realized that it got made into a Netflix movie, which I absolutely want to watch this season. Pedro Paramo is an interesting read, and I think it might be a difficult read if you're not paying attention, because it's a very short book. It's like 110, 120 pages. It mainly consists of vignettes where we follow a man as he comes back to the town of Comala, and he's looking for information on his father. His father is named Pedro Paramo. But not everybody in this town is alive anymore, and so we follow the history of the town of Comala and the man Pedro Paramo through these vignettes, but you're never quite sure which timeline you're in, or if you're talking to someone who's alive or someone who's dead. For some reason, I read this twice in high school, both for 10th grade and 12th grade, and I'm not quite sure why we read it twice. Like, we didn't read Steinbeck, we didn't read Frankenstein, right? We didn't read a whole bunch of other classics, but we read Pedro Paramo twice. And I'm actually really glad we did, because I really love this book, and I'm not quite sure I would love it as much if I didn't have that kind of critique or analysis that we did in those classes. But I think it's a great pick for autumnal if you're looking for something translated. Then yeah, I would check out Pedro Paramo. Okay, another category, horror or thriller books. I have nothing to recommend because I don't ever read this category. This is my least read category. Maybe I read 1 per year or 0 per year. But there is one book that I do want to pick up, and it's all because of Melody over at Bookish Melody. She has an amazing YouTube channel or booktube channel. She has some of the most eloquent single book reviews that I have ever seen. And so she did a single book review on Woodworm by Layla Martinez and translated by Sophie Hughes and Annie McDermott. I will link it down below along with her channel, which is again a small novella translated from the Spanish, less than 150 pages. The premise calls it, or it centers on a house, and in this house there are two women that cannot leave, and the town kind of considers them witches, and then something happens, a boy disappears, and all of a sudden, you know, this kind of conflict between this town and these two women is coming to a head. Something to do with the house as well that takes place. I'm not quite sure what this will be about, but it's described as a very moving and poetic read, and so I'm very intrigued, especially after Melody's raving review. Actually, there is one more book that I want to read from the horror category. That is Between Two Fires by Christopher Buehlman, which is a historical horror set in the Middle Ages during the Black Death. I know there's a lot of religious themes. I keep putting this book on my TBR and then taking it off, and then putting it on and then taking it off. So if you read it, let me know what you think about it, because some of the reviewers say that it has like very graphic and horrific scenes that they like couldn't even imagine, and that makes me just a little bit nervous. The idea of like a religious historical kind of horror book sounds intriguing to me, more so than say contemporary horrors. So if you've read it and you've liked it, please let me know down below. I want to round out the fiction picks with my kind of like other fiction category, which is like historical fiction or literary fiction. The first I want to recommend is Three Apples Fell from the Sky by Noreen Abagarian and translated from the Russian by Lisa Hayden. This is the Armenia pick for a Read the World project that I'm working on, and I think it's a great autumnal read. This is one of the very few Read the World books that was not depressing. This says it takes place in a remote kind of Armenian village, and it follows a whole bunch of elderly neighbors as they go about their daily lives. And there's a lot happening in the town, there's a lot of gossip, there's new people in town, and it's just following them as they go through kind of the normalities of life, but also really embracing the kind of simple pleasures that come with it. There's a dash of magical realism in here as well, but the cover is also extremely autumnal, but I just feel like it's a great read for kind of a more cozy, historical kind of / literary fiction pick. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke is a fantasy book, although I kind of think of it as a literary fantasy. Everybody and their mother has kind of heard of this book, so I'm not going to describe it at all. And I think more importantly, if you pick it up and you haven't read it, you shouldn't go in knowing much of anything about it, because it's the reading experience that I love so much about this book, as many of the mysteries that you're introduced to are kind of slowly revealed to you as you read further and further. This is one of my favorite books that I have read in the last few years. It is such a good book. I highly, highly recommend Piranesi. And it's got that kind of mysterious, haunting, atmospheric element that I think really lends itself well to a fall read. The one book that I want to get to in this category is The Northwoods by Daniel Mason. This is a book that has been on my TBR ever since Rick McDonnell reviewed it. I think he has a new channel name, like Lit Rick or something like this. I will link it in the video down below. But this is a book that I know that the structure of the book has really worked well for me in the past. And so this is a series of maybe short stories, you can call them short stories, but they're really chapters that are linked together through the fact they all take place in a single house in New England. And so you follow the different inhabitants of this house over time. Again, this is a structure that has worked well for me in the past. I've read books before like Roma by Stephen Saylor, which follows or covers the history of Rome through following different people in a single family line that have owned and possessed this little talisman. It's a talisman of a flying penis, actually, but it's the talisman that is passed down over time. So everybody who owns a talisman, you know, their story is told. I digress, although I do really recommend that book. That is a really good book. But I think this is a story that will work for me. This is a 5-star prediction for me. I think I will really, really like it. And that cover is also extremely autumnal. If you've gotten this far, you've probably noticed that all of these books are fiction. I want to recommend a single nonfiction book, and that is When Smoke Gets in Your Eyes and Other Lessons from the Crematory by Caitlin Doughty. This is a vocational memoir from a young mortician who works in the crematory business. And so she covers what actually happens to your body when you get cremated. But it's done so heartwarmingly and so tenderly and so sensitively that this is just such a good and very raw and emotional memoir. And she touches a lot about our relationship, especially the American relationship with death and death culture and death industry. It's a great read. It's one of my favorite memoirs. If I have to do like a top 5 or top 10 memoir, this would definitely make the list. Thanks for watching my mashup of all things fall books. Hopefully I've highlighted something that you might find interesting, or you can tell me if you have a really good, really seasonal autumnal read that I should check out in the next few months. I will see you guys later. Please take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye.